I think has always been, okay, cross membership between consortia. I think this has always been a feature of the industry where you would have carriers participating, say, in a major alliance on a route, and they may also have some smaller arrangements, slot charter arrangements on a bilateral basis within the overall geographic scope covered by the alliance service. Whether that's a trend or whether it requires particular consideration, I think is a little debatable. So if we go on to the next slide, and what I'm going to do here over the next few slides is just to remind us all what the Commission concluded in relation to those 5 criteria: effectiveness, efficiency, coherence, relevance, and EU added value in its previous review, and which led it to conclude that the block exemption ought to be renewed. So in relation to effectiveness, the Commission said that compared to a baseline in which it would be absent, i.e. no block exemption, the block exemption facilitates the conclusion of consortia arrangements by making the assessment of their compatibility with Article 101, i.e. European competition law, easier, and by providing higher legal certainty that decreases legal risk. So next, please. So in relation to efficiency, so in the absence of consortia block exemption, the assessment of compliance with competition rules would be more complex, increasing the costs associated with self-assessment and possibly requiring the advice of external lawyers. So next, please. Relevance, is the block exemption still relevant? The Commission said yes. There's no reason to depart from the long-standing view, in fact, the view that has prevailed since before 1995, that consortia are an efficient way of providing and improving liner shipping services. Moreover, a fair share of the benefits resulting from those efficiencies are passed on to consumers. Cooperation in consortia is and will remain the mainstay of the industry. Furthermore, a material number of existing consortia appear to fall within the scope of the block exemption, and for those that don't fall within it, it's still a useful guidance in self-assessment under Article 101.3. Next slide, please. So coherence, is the block exemption coherent with other EU policies, such as environmental policy? The Commission said yes. So the evaluation has shown that the special features of the industry, which relies heavily on cooperation, still merits an exceptional sector-specific block exemption. It's coherent with other EU policies, such as environmental protection, particularly because vessel sharing arrangements, consortia contribute to reduce fuel consumption and technological development. So bigger, better ships, more sophisticated, better IT systems. And then next slide, please. And then EU added value. So the question here was whether it's right for the Commission to take action at EU level as opposed to at member state level. And the Commission said, yes, it is. It's more appropriate for guidance to be provided, given the international nature of liner shipping services, than at member state level. So the block exemption provides added value, also compared with the existing legal instruments, providing general guidance on the application of competition rules. So there is a benefit in terms of specific terminology and content in providing sector-specific guidance, rather than simply relying on the general guidance in European competition law. So the question is really whether any of those evaluations have changed, whether there is anything in the way that the industry has evolved since 2020, which is actually only 2 years ago, which might lead the Commission to come to different conclusions. As Marjorie said, obviously one big event that has taken place is the pandemic. So on the next slide, please, I just want to refer everybody to the way that the Commission, in the person of the Executive Vice President, Margaret Vestager, the Commissioner for Competition, has responded to questions that have been raised by members of the European Parliament, who have naturally raised concerns of the kind that Marjorie was referring to about the increases in prices for shipping, delays, congestion, and whether any of those problems, which are extreme and undeniable, can be laid at the door of the liner shipping industry and consortia in particular. And so what the Commissioner said in written answers to those questions is, first, the Commission has been monitoring the sector, but has not identified any anti-competitive behaviour from alliances aimed at increasing freight rates. And this is the same view as shared by the US and China regulatory authorities. And then she went on to say, it does not seem that regulatory intervention could substitute market mechanisms in sorting out the current congestion problems in logistic chains and imbalances between demand and supply in the maritime transport sector, which have, of course, led to these terrible blockages, imbalances, increased prices and delay. So that's what the Commissioner said in March. And then in May, another question was put to the Commission, which she responded to in somewhat similar terms, again saying that the Commission has been gathering information. She referred to the questionnaires, the fact-finding that I mentioned earlier, asking about market changes and the impact of the COVID crisis. And then she said, no anti-competitive behaviour from alliances has been identified at this stages. And then she went on to say that the causes of the price increases and service issues are multifaceted, not the same across the world. She referred to changing consumption patterns, port congestion, asymmetric recoveries of world economies and unavailability of workers, which threw out of balance a delicately optimized business with little margin to absorb shocks. And then she referred to Russia's invasion of Ukraine. And then the same basic conclusion that regulatory intervention would not appear to be a substitute for market mechanisms in resolving the current issues in the logistics chains. So she there, I think, is saying fairly clearly that, yes, there clearly are problems which are multifaceted, but we can't extrapolate from that there is any basis for intervention on the grounds of any sort of anti-competitive misconduct, let alone laying the blame at the door of the alliances and consortia. So if I could just go on to my last slide, which is a sort of concluding statement that if it ain't broke, don't fix it, which has really been the sort of guiding principle that the Commission has adopted ever since 1995, when it first adopted a block exemption for consortia, and has renewed it periodically ever since. So that was 27 years ago. When we come up to the conclusion of the next review, that'll be 29 years. The Commission said in its previous review in 2019-20 that it had consistently taken the view and saw no reason to depart from the view that consortia are efficiency enhancing. Those benefits are shared with customers and consumers, and any change to the system would cause costs and legal uncertainty. So what about the pandemic? Well, as the Commissioner said, there were many different causes, which I don't need to go through here, but really the question which is relevant to the review of the block exemption is whether those problems were caused or exacerbated by consortia, and would they be alleviated, or if the block exemption were withdrawn, and if any such challenges were to arise in the future, would the world be better off without a block exemption for consortia? Well, as I've said, DG Comp found no evidence to support that view, that consortia have contributed to these problems. And indeed, the view on the carrier side of that discussion is that consortia are far more likely to have helped than hindered carriers' ability to respond to these challenges. And of course, one has to bear in mind, this really is my sort of final word, that the consortia block exemption was never intended to be, a panacea for all the world's problems in transport the transport supply chain. Nor should anybody think that tinkering with the block exemption, or indeed withdrawing it, would similarly solve any or all of the problems in the global supply chain. It's a tool of limited purpose, but it's not a magic wand. And I think there is a tendency in some quarters to view these reviews, and no doubt this upcoming review, as an opportunity to look for the world, which is frankly unrealistic, because the block exemption doesn't, it has a limited purpose, and it can't be an excuse, an opportunity to give everything that everybody would want. It has a very limited purpose. So with that, I'll stop and hand it back to Rob.
Well, thank you very much, Matthew and Marjorie, for really excellent, clear presentations. The only thing I'd say, and maybe channeling a little bit of Mark Clough, is that perspectives that you bring are from the carrier side, and that I just wonder, I sensed a little bit of a kind of nothing to see here, nothing has changed, not a big issue, and I'll pick up on the last point you made, which is that it's not a magic wand and that it has a limited remit. And I will provocatively say that that cuts both ways. So both of you made reference to the enormous benefits that were supposedly flowing from the consortia, but in fact, you need to distinguish between, as at various points you did, the alliances, which fall outside the block exemption, and therefore you can't really call on them to be evidence of the benefits of the block exemption. Why talk about freight rates? Because they're not part of the block exemption either, so that's irrelevant to the conversation. So I wonder whether, in fact, there's a need for a bit more clarity, which is what precisely is the content of the block exemption and what precisely are the benefits that can be said to flow from it, as opposed to correlations with cause, in other words, cause and effect rather than correlations, and in relation to the specific things that the block exemption covers rather than the things and the organizations that it doesn't cover. So that's one thing I would comment on. The other is I did look up some information this morning about the position as regards new tonnage, because traditionally the container industry, when it makes money, and one of the criticisms that's been made by shippers is that too much money has been made. Well, it appears as if the industry is going to spend a lot of that money buying new ships. In fact, some extraordinary statistics, according to Alpha Liner, the capacity now on order is more or less 28% of the on-the-water capacity that exists today. And one particular line, MSC, has ordered 33.4% of its on-the-water capacity. So obviously you can't tie that directly to the effects of consortia, because, for example, MSC is in a big alliance which falls out. But interestingly, if you look at the kinds of vessels that are being ordered, then they are not the ultra large vessels so much. They're kind of middle of the range vessels, much smaller than the previous trend. So that, to the extent to which consortia facilitates the buying of more efficient vessels, then that must cut across the argument that the bigger the vessel, the lower the costs. But interestingly, it appears as if quite a lot of the vessels are, for example, LNG capable or LNG ready, and that a very high proportion of them will be fitted with scrubbers from day one. So you can look at environmental aspects, but I would argue that those are little to do with competition law from a legal point of view. Certainly very controversial whether the Commission is going to be entitled under 1013 to take into account environmental benefits for the public at large. That's an interesting legal issue. So those are really comments to kind of get some thoughts going. We've got one at least question from the floor, but I wonder whether you would like to respond to any of those points before we move to that.
Shall I begin then, Marjorie, and you take over? So in your first point, alliances versus consortia that benefit from the block exemption. I mean, I absolutely agree, and it's a point that the Commission was very alive to as well in the previous review, that when we think about the relevance of the block exemption, you need to think about which consortia actually fall within its scope. And certainly the view that they took then was that 2 out of 3 of the big alliances probably actually exceeded the market share threshold, and therefore were not relevant, you know, either sort of positively or negatively to the assessment. You know, positively because positive claims can be made for those alliances, but equally the big alliances were the subject of a lot of the attack coming particularly from the ITF. So now, I mean, it's absolutely right that the assessment of the benefits achieved by the block exemption need to be assessed in relation to those consortia that fall within its scope. I mean, I absolutely take that point. You know, I don't think, I mean, I suppose just one other point about that is that, you know, the alliances, simply because they are so big, and, you know, in this world of transport people like us, you know, everybody knows about them. You read a lot more about them than you do read about, you know, a probably much smaller consortium on some smaller, you know, possibly north-south trade, or maybe it's an intra-Europe trade, you know, or trade between Europe and South America, or some other part of the world, not the major east-west trades. So actually, the public debate is rather distorted because it's very much focused on those alliances that don't actually benefit from the block exemption. Which also, you know, another consequence of that is that you know, the data that is available also tends to be, you know, greater in relation to the alliances than the consortia which are relevant. You know, so that's certainly presents a challenge for those of us who are on the, you know, the side of defending the block exemption, and the Commission as well, in trying to assess its application.
Thanks, Matthew. Marjorie?
Yeah, I'd just add that it's interesting that you say that it's middle range size ships that are being ordered. That would suggest that that's for different trades. You know, that the alliances tend to be east-west trades, and the bigger ships are on the Asia to Europe trade. But some of the smaller trades, the north-south trades, as Matthew's mentioned, the ship size is smaller because demand is smaller, but also there's drafting. There's reasons why particular ships of a certain size can't get into particular ports on some trades. So that would suggest that if they're ordering middle range ships, they are actually needing them for the alliances or the consortia that are not part of the big alliances. So it's good to see that there is a lot of investment going on. And with that much investment, you would expect a lot of competition in the market.
Yeah.
So those are all plans.
Thank you, Marjorie. So I've got a question here for you, actually, from Professor Francesco Munari. I don't know whether you've been able to see that on your chat, quick Q&A function.
You're talking to me, I don't have the chat to...
Okay, so...
read it out.
Well, the essence of it is that there's a growing concern about increased market power and market concentration with consortia and alliances, and for upstream and downstream markets, in particular, the effect on public investments in infrastructure. And I think his question is, from the environmental viewpoint, the assessment should not be made focusing on the purely maritime aspect, i.e. the ship, but a more holistic approach seems to be better. Now, I'm not sure whether he is concerned that the Commission is going to, by looking at environmental factors, if it's going to sort of have a narrow view because it'll only look at the vessels. But I guess his point is that environmental goes much broader than the vessel that's involved in the maritime leg only of the logistics supply chain.
Yeah, so the block exemption just covers sea to sea. It doesn't cover inland. But I think the point he's trying to make is I have seen some arguments that very large ships do result in more congestion.
Mm-hmm.
I think that was that argument was previously put, and the Commission didn't seem to think that the evidence put forward actually showed that. But I know that that is something that's been put forward, that if you get large ships, they can cause more congestion.
Okay. I'm looking at the time and realizing that we're perilously close to 2 o'clock. So I think if there are no more questions, I'm going to hand to.
I think, Rob, we have one more question actually.
Okay, yeah, I've just seen that.
Yeah.
The question is from. I'm not quite sure if I can pronounce the name, perhaps Kolf. So noting that if the Commission didn't extend the block exemption, then it would have to start a huge exercise of looking at self-assessments under 101(3), which I think is probably uncontroversial, but will probably, well, would depend whether the Commission did it on an owner initiative, depend why it would not, why have decided to, it decided not to extend. But the following question, I think, is the real one, which is if the block exemption is revoked, will it have an impact on self-assessment? Would it make it more difficult to get individual exemption? Because the lack of continuation would undermine the argument that there are efficiencies flowing from the block exemption.
Yeah, I mean, if I just respond to that, I think it rather depends on what the grounds for the revocation might be. If the Commission, it's entirely possible that the Commission might say, yes, we're persuaded that consortia are still a good thing, but we don't see the need for a sector-specific piece of legislation, in which case self-assessments ought to continue unchanged. Clearly there'd be issues around legal certainty, uncertainty, legal cost, etc. But at least the revocation shouldn't, in Europe, cast doubt on the legitimacy of consortia. One point, though, is that carriers are concerned that the position taken in the EU does have quite a sort of flagship impact on the way that authorities and courts around the world view these arrangements. And whilst we may, in Europe, say, okay, just because the Commission has withdrawn the block exemption doesn't undermine the assessment of consortia, that isn't necessarily how that change would be understood around the world. And there may well be some negative inferences drawn, which might actually make it harder to justify or persuade authorities elsewhere that they are lawful and legitimate and pro-competitive.
Thank you. Vincent, do you want to wrap things up? I think we've just gone over the hour.
No problem, Rob. Well, I think, ladies and gentlemen, you've seen an absolute masterclass. Marjorie and Matthew, I'm sure you'd agree, Rob, have presented the cases so lucidly and clearly. When you think back in Marjorie's analysis, it was quite right to go back to the 22nd of December 1986 and the Council Regulation 4056 of 86, which was actually adopted under the UK presidency. And it's interesting now that you have the UK also having its own debate now about whether to extend, and if so, on what terms, this consortium block exemption. So whether you could actually have, and as Matthew has just said about the flagship impact, whether there could actually be a divergence between the UK and the European Commission and how that will operate. So Marjorie gave a tremendous masterclass about the history of it, how price is a 4-letter word in the area of consortiums, and the block exemption, the flexibility and the coordination, the efficiency, and the wealth of detail that she had, not only to go back to the 22nd of December 1986, but to give you the figures from the first week in September. That was a tremendous presentation. And Matthew equally just equaled it in great measure. The whole interesting thing about the timing of it, how the current Commission's mandate will run out on the 31st of October 2024, and this is quite early. It's certainly, you couldn't describe the European Commission as doing lastminute.com type stuff in the context of the Consortia block exemption, because initially when people thought about, is it running out next year? No, it's the year after. So it is quite interesting. And the insight into how the Commission looks at these things and so on, which Matthew described, was so helpful. And the danger is, it's a little bit like plotting. When all you have is a hammer, everything is a nail. And there's a risk that people may read so much from COVID and these unusual circumstances of COVID into the review. And you see that in the area of financial services regulation, so much as still people looking back into the rear view mirror of 2008. Now, we hope that COVID-19 is in the rear view mirror, but it's interesting in that way. So thank you very much to the two questions. They were really, really helpful. And Rob, thank you for, I think the Americans would describe it as, Jeff and others on the call will correct me, but quarterbacking the question and answer section so well. And remember that all of you will have the opportunity to continue this discussion. Remember, you got the best legal advice imaginable from Marjorie and Matthew there. Now, it's not legal advice, no liability is held, but you got wonderful insights, and you can continue that at the annual conference. So do think about, we'll get the details out of the Save the Date, and do think about attending that, and that would be really useful. So at this stage, it's time for the credits. And as John Kenneth Galbraith used to say in speeches, he said, I would say the word finally, if only to give the audience hope. So in this sort of context, I'm just saying finally, the credits really have to go to Katrina Preen, Katrine in Garrison and Federspiel, without whom any of this wouldn't happen. That's the beauty of the contribution of Martin and his team there. The technology makes all this work. In Copenhagen, Sarah in the UK, Tess Bright in Cyprus, and do remember, do come to the EMLO annual conference. There'll be some more webinars, but it would be great to have the first in-person meeting since Cyprus in October 2019, I think it was, just or 2019 or 2020. It just shows you how long ago we met in person. But we need to do that, and it'll be a great opportunity for you to meet people from industry, from the judiciary, from the administration, and federal lawyers, and also people who just love maritime law. So on your behalf, I'd like to thank Marjorie, to thank Matthew, to thank Rob, and to thank all the great team behind today's presentation. So thank you, and be safe, and good luck.
Thanks, everybody.
Thank you, Vincent. Bye-bye. Marjorie, well done.